Hi there, and thanks for joining us from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. I'm WCVB News Center 5's Antoinette Antonio.
And I'm Janice Hodson. I'm the museum curator here for the Library and Museum.
I'm Alan Price, director here at the Library and Museum, and we're delighted to welcome you to a virtual tour of First Children, Caroline and John Jr. in the White House. Welcome. I hope you'll enjoy it with us.
So Janice, obviously we're in an area here showing a lot of different magazine covers. Can you tell us a little bit about what this part of the exhibit is?
Well, this deals with how the media fed the public fascination with the children. I mean, it's what feeds what. The public were interested. There were young kids in the White House. There hadn't been one young kids in the White House since the early 20th century. And the media played into that. And you can see, we took a sampling of magazine covers from the time period and wanted it to run the gamut of things like Newsweek, which would be considered, an informed, periodical, to more tabloidy type of things like Motion Picture. How long can they hide the truth from Caroline? These titillating titles, when in reality the article says something like, how long can they hide the truth from Caroline, that she's not just like the girl next door and her family aren't like your neighbors, they're in the White House. You had media pointing out they're the equivalent of a royal family for this country, and the children were part of that.
How hard was it for Mrs. Kennedy to kind of control all of this? Mm-hmm. Especially when you compare to what the first family deals with today in terms of social media, in terms of the press. Was she allowed, and did she have more control in terms of media?
She tried as much as she could to have control. It was a time, as you said, where the majority of Americans were getting their news from printed sources. You had the element of television that was relatively new. By 1960, when Kennedy is running for president, I think 90% of American households had TVs by that time. 10 years before, it was a fraction of that. So it's the medium that Kennedy played to. And the kids ended up being recorded, as well, and they'd be broadcast in your living room.
So these were the first children who were more widely on television.
On television, yes. And they were the youngest kids to occupy the White House since Teddy Roosevelt's kids at the beginning of the 20th century. So there was an interest. And, when Kennedy was running for president, it was the first time that something like 47% of of Americans who were eligible to vote were like the age 40 and under. So they were the same age range as the president. Like him, they were World War II veterans who had young families. So the kids were part of what helped people identify with Kennedy. And
these
Kennedy
were America's kids.
recognized, and Kennedy recognized the value in that. His wife wanted to preserve the children's privacy as much as possible. So these memos that were informal memos written by her that are part of our archives. One's to Pierre Salinger, who was Kennedy's press secretary. Talk about how, we know there's nothing we can do about the tabloids and the children being in the media. But, this photo play article, it's just, the quotes are wrong. Their nanny would have never said that. We can sue them. Usually, she was advised to just let it go because more attention will be created by trying to protest these things. In this memo over here, she references this Life magazine cover. But she notes in this memo specifically, JFK was responsible for letting Life use Marshall Hawkins' cover of Macaroni. That's the pony here. If he approves anything else on children, John and he for a look, etc. Could I be told about it first? So yeah,
you get the sense
yeah.
of her tone when it comes
Yeah.
to the media.
Yeah.
Well, I like this line right here. If the press has questions about the children, what does Caroline want for Christmas?
Yeah,
Say that
she's
they don't
saying-
want to give it away.
Yeah, say Mrs. K is very sorry, but she doesn't want to give any info about the children this year. This is October 1962, and by that time she's saying, major effort to be made this year to keep children out of papers and magazines.
So how long after they arrived in the White House did her hard effort start to keep the kids out of the magazines?
Well, very early.
Very early. It didn't take very long.
Yeah. Kennedy's family moved in February 1961. This is April 1961. And Mrs. Kennedy was upset that photographers using zoom lenses and things were taking pictures of her kids while they were playing on the White House lawn from the fence. And she wanted, they requested a ban on that type of activity. It didn't mean that it didn't continue to happen, but there was, a certain level of respect. So it did help curb things. The White House photographers would take these pictures, and Mrs. Kennedy would have photo shoots. And then she would select, and the White House would select which ones they would circulate.
So I would say the photo shoots, the pictures that were sent to the press and to the magazines, this would be the more modern day equivalent of putting it on your own Instagram. Because as a mom, she wants to protect her children, but she also understands that there is a fascination with the first family.
And this was a way of dealing with it. There was enough interest that pictures of the family, were as much wanted by people as, an official presidential portrait.
How does she walk that line of giving the people what they want versus protecting her kids?
Well, as you can see from the memo, sometimes it didn't work to the level that she wanted. She wanted tighter control than what she was able to achieve. You sense it in the memos and some of the other things in her papers, her writings, that she was going to try and put up a fight, but a lot of times, there was nothing much that could be done about certain things. She was as popular as the children. They wanted to remain on her good side, I would say. If they wanted to be continued to be allowed to come in, and there were only very limited photographers who were allowed to actually go into the White House and photograph the children.
So did they stay off the lawn when she asked?
I think they did, but there are some references later on to photographs being shot through the fence. So, I guess I think it depended on the individual photographer and the type of publication, maybe. Yeah.
Did she have any particular type of publication that she was more geared towards?
Well, she hated the tabloids, but she realized that there was nothing she could do about it. She did, make statements to the effect that, it's one thing if they put my husband or me on the cover, but my children are another thing. But it really became out of control unless it was something that she might be able to be claimed to be completely libelous. So next, I'm going to take you into the section that kind of dovetails with this, discussion of Mrs. Kennedy and wanting to protect her children and their privacy, and part of how she did it.
Well, now we've moved on to another exhibit. We are in the White House school area, and this is really fascinating. This is not the first White House school, but it likely was the last time the White House had a school inside.
Jacqueline Kennedy had an experience where Caroline had ballet classes outside of the White House, which was no issue until until her husband became president. And then Caroline was being followed by reporters. So Mrs. Kennedy decided to create what was initially called a play group. It kind of evolved into a nursery, and then by the time Caroline was school age, it became a first grade classroom, and John Jr. was part of the play group ultimately. But it was comprised of children who were the kids of their close friends, and the parents all pooled their resources and funded the salary of the teachers. The parents pooled resources for the supplies, books. There was a trampoline that was purchased for the school kids. It was her way of providing her kids with an environment where they were learning in something like a classroom setting with other children, but again, it was controlled. They were behind these 4 private walls. And
they were still in the White House.
They were, yeah. And these were, they knew the parents of the other students, and they weren't going to be blabbing to reporters about,
Was this her way of giving them, she's known for saying she wants her children to have a happy, normal life, obviously as normal as it can be when you're living in the White House. Was this her way to give that to them?
Yeah. This was a way. And it's interesting because in doing that, it also brought the White House school into focus with current events of the time. From the time that Mrs. Kennedy announced to the press that the school was being developed, some of the first questions were, is it going to be integrated? Because when Kennedy took office, segregation had been rendered illegal by the Supreme Court in the previous decade, but of course, most schools were not compliant, particularly in the South. And from the time he was on the campaign trail, that was part of his campaign, that he would fight for equal rights, that he would fight to enforce desegregation laws. He was slower at doing them than a lot of people wanted him to be. So the correspondence that he got reflected, both sides. And the question about integration of the White House school was coming from both people who encouraged that as a very visible way for Kennedy to demonstrate his sincerity, and from racist white supremacists who said, well, what business do you have telling us that our children have to go to school with Negroes when you're not doing this with your children?
Did the school start out integrated?
It did not start out integrated.
Did the school become integrated?
It became integrated at the time that they created the first grade classroom. The African-American boy who became part of the school was Avery Hatcher, who was the son of Andrew Hatcher, who was Kennedy's assistant press secretary.
This was something that had very mixed opinions, the subject of integration. Having a class in the White House in and of itself, how was that received by the public?
People were interested in it. Some people wanted to know how it was funded. It was also something where occasionally you'd see an article, Caroline skipped school because she didn't go to a class because of some family outing or something. And the kids were a large presence within the White House. They would routinely, they'd be outside doing their exercises, or they'd be playing out on the lawn.
At the time, did the public get to see any of these pictures, or was it just something that they had heard of and seen in print writing?
It was something they had heard of and seen articles about, so they knew it existed, and they knew Caroline went to the school. Avery Hatcher was the only one who was actually named because he was the child being integrated, which kind of puts him in a different spot, because they consistently said, well, that's a private matter. We don't reveal the names of the children, but they revealed Avery Hatcher's name.
It's interesting to me, the contrast between these two bays of the exhibit. The first one, the images are just so staged, where this feels so much more intimate, almost like normal childhood.
Yeah, they're like family snapshots, basically, except it was at the White House. I think the example most people know is and one that actually did get a lot of media coverage. It was Stanley Tredek's image of John Jr. under the Resolute desk, playing while Kennedy's sitting at the desk. But,
that's a famous image.
Iconic.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're going to move on, actually, to that section of the exhibit now.
So here we are in the next exhibit. Let's call this one behind the scenes. And obviously that is what we're seeing here. These are portraits, some from the official White House photographers, really giving us an inside look as to what life was like in the White House for the children.
Yeah, it's just like, your family albums at home. You've got pictures of your kids in their Halloween costumes, or oh, here we are walking outside the house. It just happens to be the White House. Then we do have a few official, images that were taken specifically for the media. These were taken for one of the photojournals by Stanley Tredek, and it just illustrates how the kids had free reign. And this was a shoot that happened while Mrs. Kennedy was away. It happens. So you have, not coincidentally. This was something that she did know that her husband wanted to do this. It's actually the shoot that she references in the memo in the first gallery. But even under normal circumstances, the kids were allowed this type of free reign. There are accounts of diplomats and heads of state visiting one-on-one with Kennedy in the Oval Office and being interrupted by Caroline wanting to come in and give her father a kiss. John Jr. coming in to show his father something. Andre Gromyko got interrupted by John Jr. and he noted, in Soviet Union, we love the kids. They're really popular there. And this is what Kennedy knew. So this was a meeting with his closest advisors, and you just look at the seriousness, obviously, of what was being discussed, and you have a little kid playing, in the same space. Everybody's kind of used to, I guess, his presence. They're not really paying attention.
It almost seems like these images help humanize the administration for Americans, but they humanize America for others overseas.
Yes.
So the president knew exactly what he was doing then. He was allowing a lot of these pictures to be taken.
He did understand that his children, and he enjoyed having his children. I mean, he really, liked having his children barge in on him. He took a real delight in them, but he also recognized that, like Alan said, this helped humanize their image.
And he saw the benefit of putting out pictures like this for the public to see.
They had a sandbox on the lawn. They had a swing set. The kids, swam in the fountain. Here's the trampoline that was bought for the White House school kids. They're cooking, hot dogs and hamburgers outside. This wasn't meant for public consumption. This was just documenting, a family, gathering with friends invited.
These are real intimate family photos. When you're in any other family, these would be typical family photos. Mm-hmm. For a first family at this time, these are really intimate photos.
I love this one of John Jr., who's playing with the recording room equipment. There are images of him playing around in the helicopter that was used by the president, sitting at the controls and things like that. This image is one that was taken by one of the preferred photographers that the Kennedys used, an outside photographer. So this was an image that was done for public consumption. Actually, this one predates the White House. This is in Georgetown, but it represents something that was a daily activity for Caroline and her father that continued into the White House. She would have she would sit with him when he would have breakfast every morning.
Every morning.
Yeah, and that was, a time they had together. And there was, interestingly, yes, would have been in their private quarters as opposed to these types of images taken by the White House photographers that happened in what you could think of as not public spaces, but not the strictly private spaces. These were the spaces that were open to other White House staff, to dignitaries, in some cases to the press.
So in a lot of the photos we've seen, the children clearly had free run of the White House. Now, did they ever come into contact with the press, with any reporters? Because they're also in the White House. So did they have any interactions with them?
They did run into into reporters.
Frequently?
Especially, well, I don't know how frequently, but I think it was something that wasn't necessarily anticipated when they first got into the White House. The first interaction, Caroline she went into the White House communications room. That's what it was. And there were some reporters there, and someone just casually asked her, "Oh, where's your father?" And she said something like, "Oh, he's not doing anything. He's just sitting around with his shoes off and, not doing anything." And it ended up, it makes the Washington Post, yeah.
Interesting to me, as you try as parents to create as normal a childhood as possible in the strangest of circumstances where it may be impossible. So that's a tight line to walk.
Yeah, and just images that emphasized just the normalcy of childhood behavior, but in a setting where you're not used to seeing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they really are just kids being kids.
Yeah. The offshoot of one of the offshoots of the popularity of the kids was then he started getting into this area of the commercialization of the children, which was something Mrs. Kennedy understandably had a problem with. And we're going to be going into that section next.
Okay, from behind the scenes, here we are in the area of pop culture. And this is the part of the exhibit where we really get to learn about the country, really the whole world's fascination with the Kennedy family. This is actually a record album.
Yes. First Family was very popular, sold millions of copies, but it was somewhat controversial for the time period. Von Meter was this fellow who, started gaining some attention because he was able to mimic Kennedy's voice and accent quite well. Our archives show that Jacqueline Kennedy did want to try and suppress it, and then was kind of dissuaded from making a big deal about it because it would only create more interest in it. But she drew a line with Von Meter's live performances. You can see from the cover, you have this adult, dressed up like a little kid, and you have a baby carriage there. So the children did feature on the album, which by today's standards would be considered very gentle, but stand-up comedians had never used a president as a subject, really.
Let alone their children.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Political cartoons have a long history, but live performance did not.
Yeah. After Von Meter appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, Jacqueline Kennedy drafted this memo to her personal secretary. She saw it, she had a serious problem with it because he had a child in the sketch and the child's name was Caroline. And it's a wonderful internal memo because it really gives you a sense of how angry this type of commercialization of her children made her.
She doesn't mince words in this letter.
She said, we didn't interfere with the album. We don't, as she puts it, I don't give a damn what he does with the album. But that it's an appalling taste that he should make money out of a 5-year-old child. I would just like him to know that I consider him a rat as far as the children are concerned. But then she leaves it up to her secretary, either if you think this should be communicated to him, do it. Otherwise, just forget about it. He was concerned and distressed himself because he never meant to offend the president and the first lady. Kennedy had no problem with it. He actually kind of liked it, but
talking about things that may or may not have offended Mrs. Kennedy. Let's move on this way. So these are some of the other pop culture items. We have paper dolls, plates. We have charm bracelets.
Yep. Bubblegum cards, activity books, little cartoon books. And really there was no, their images weren't licensed in the way that celebrities will license their images
so
today.
These were unauthorized,
They
essentially.
were, yeah. As you see down here, we have this doll made by Madame Alexander, and they called it Caroline. There was also an adult doll that came with it called Jacqueline. And the two dolls were sent to the White House. Madame Alexander was hoping for some type of official approval. Well, she didn't get it. So then, unlike some other manufacturers who just would have gone on and continued to promote the doll, it did go up for sale. There were advertisements in papers during the holiday season in 1962. And, one of the articles said, some new Kennedys are in town. Madame Alexander then came out and tried to say, well, they have nothing to do with the Kennedys. They're just dolls named Jacqueline and Caroline. She was really hoping that Mrs. Kennedy would say, I think these dolls are wonderful, and she didn't. She tried to claim that they didn't represent the Kennedys, but obviously they did. They even had wardrobe ensembles that coincided with, that dovetailed with the family's interests. You had little riding outfits and things like that for the horses.
So as with some of the paper dolls and those items and the other dolls, there was a lot of focus on Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline as far as the fashion goes.
Yeah.
But then you have something else like this. This is a board game featuring the Kennedys.
Yes. And it was developed by a couple of editors from the Harvard Lampoon. And it all has to do with brokering power and media image. It's very much a reflection of the influence of television on a persona. So it's not just, you can see a range of Kennedys represented here, but it includes the two children. So you have categories like social standing, influential friends, popular support, position of importance, and it's a rather complicated game. The instructions are multi-pages long, but you can see the tongue-in-cheek character of some of these cards.
Oh, turn of events card.
Yes,
That's what
yes. Turn of events cards, which determined whether you as a player were one of the Kennedys. Mm-hmm. And depending on what card you pulled, it determined whether you were going to lose points in a category or gain points. So something like John Jr.'s first word is Cuba, so he loses influential friends.
Caroline swallows live frog, loses personal image.
Yeah. So it's just a great kind of quirky example of some of the products that were produced during the time that Kennedy was in office.
Again, something that's not authorized by the first family.
You go from these commercial items to other parts of the exhibit which focus on what in the midst of this blitz of publicity and these commercial items, what people were moved to send the children. And in Caroline's case, that was predominantly dolls. The gifts tended to be very separated and established gender kind of roles of the time.
So here we are at the next exhibit. We can obviously see there are lots of dolls here. These were sent to Caroline as gifts, correct?
Yes, some by heads of state, some by individuals from the various countries that the dolls came from. Some we don't know who sent them. We just know the countries they represent. Most are dressed in like costumes that reflect the particular country's national identity. I like, I'm just being subjective in this case because this is a girl I'm particularly fond of. She was a state gift given to Caroline Kennedy by the president of Cyprus in 1962. And she's dressed in a rural costume, but I just like, the heft of her, and the glancing eyes are just wonderful. She was given dolls so frequently that there were newspaper articles about the size of her collection. When she was given a new doll, the phrase I liked best was, she has a doll, United Nations.
Obviously, she received so many dolls, and this is just a fraction of what was kept. What happened to all the other dolls? How did they decide what was kept, and what else happened to the rest of the dolls?
Yeah, the impression is that state gifts, from important personages tended to be hung on to or stored, although there are some we know they received and they disappeared. It may be that the kids actually played with them and destroyed them. So a lot of the dolls were set aside as being special. Caroline Kennedy particularly mentions the Hina doll sets that were given to her as being special sets that she really caught her imagination as a child. Other toys that came from, average, your everyday citizens, sometimes they were kept and stored and ended up just coming directly to the presidential library. Others were given away.
I understand that the combination of world dolls with a map of the world was used as part of her geography instruction.
Well, it's similar to her grandmother, Rose Kennedy.
Yes.
Because Rose Kennedy had a map set up where her dolls were, and she was big on, teaching her kids geography. And
I see that in this display, you have the flags of the different countries along with the dolls so that students coming today can make those same geographic connections.
Yeah. That was something we worked with the education department, tying it into that United Nations of dolls, theme.
And when we look at some of the outfits of the dolls, these are things that are really timeless.
They were primarily based on national folk costumes, which could vary from region to region within a country and locale to locale. So, it was how these countries self-identified with their folk traditions.
So some of these dolls are actually dolls that you can go to any of these different countries and purchase today?
And still get similar ones, like the doll from Guatemala, dolls being produced as souvenirs today, really pretty much resemble that.
Well, seeing all the dolls along with the international flags and markings has really been so informative, as was the entire exhibit. This really is just a fantastic piece of history that we have here located in Boston. So I just want to thank you for having me and hosting me and giving me an inside look.
Well, it's been great having you here with us to appreciate this history. I'm curious, having been through the exhibit, what is a highlight, what sticks out in your mind, or is there some deeper reflection about what this exhibit represents for you?
Really the thing that stuck out to me most as we walked through the exhibit is that President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, above all, they were a mom and a dad. And this really gives us an inside look at President Kennedy's last few years of his life, getting to spend time with the children. And of course, we had the conversation about Mrs. Kennedy trying to protect the children when it comes to their exposure to the world, the media, the press. That's just something that a mother does. And then also the juxtaposition, how she, in a way, tried to control what was put out in the media in terms of releasing photos, getting to pick what the public saw and what the public didn't see. Very different than this day and age that we're living in of social media. So it was just really fascinating to get to see all of this and getting to see the pictures and getting to see some of the old pop culture items. It's just a one-of-a-kind exhibit.